Thank you, Julie. Thank you, My Jewish Learning. Thanks to all of you for being here. What a joy. And I'm finding, like, during this past year, it was gatherings like this that were such a source of life, finding people all around the world to study Torah together. And now, even as we're able to convene in-person community safely, this is still so great. What a thing that we've gathered from the creativity that comes through exile. So I'm really glad to be here with you. This week, as Julie said, we read two Parashiot, Matot-Masei, to conclude the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. There's a potpourri of different things that happen in these two Parashiot to close the book of Bamidbar. One major story in the first of the two Parashiot, Matot, is a negotiation between the tribes of Reuven and Gad and half of the tribe of Menashe, negotiating with Moshe. Basically, you may recall last week, toward the end of the parsha, the Israelites marched forward and waged war with some of the desert nations on the eastern side of the Jordan before crossing over into the land. Sichon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan, and so on. And they took hold of some lands on the eastern side. Today, the tribes of Reuven, Gad, and half the tribe of Menashe come to Moshe and they're like, "Hey, we kind of like this land over here. It's good pasture land. We have a lot of flocks. We want to stay here." And Moshe flips out. He just hears echoes of 40 years ago of the scouts being like, "We don't really want to cross into Eretz Yisrael. Like, back then it was like, we're grasshoppers, they're monsters, they're going to destroy us. We can't do it. And that was a catastrophe. And Moshe's finally ready to bless the people to go forward. And now 2.5 tribes he hears them saying, "I don't know, we should pass into the land." They have this whole long negotiation, and the 2.5 tribes are like, no, we're not afraid of the land. We just think this is economically good for us here. And the agreement they reach is that these tribes will go forward as part of the military campaign with everybody else. They'll be part of the people. They're not gonna sit back while everybody else puts themselves in danger. They're not gonna risk the other members of the people resenting them. They're gonna be part of it. And then once the war is settled, they then get to go back. That's where I want to enter with. I want to jump on an interesting phrase Moshe says when negotiating with them. So you have the source sheet and the link. I'm also going to share screen. Okay. So here in chapter 32 of Bamidbar, they've laid out the terms of the agreement, and Moshe said to them, "So if you do this, if you go to battle as shock troops before Hashem, and every shock fighter among you crosses the Jordan before Hashem, until God has dispossessed his enemies before him, and the land has been subdued before Hashem. Afterward, only afterward you return. Then I'll agree to it." And his language for that is, "V'hitem nikiyim me'Adonai Yisrael." Then you shall be clean or blameless before Adonai and before Israel, and this land shall be your holding under Adonai. What I want to consider with you today is the full agadic and halachic implications of this phrase, "You shall be clean or blameless before Adonai and before Israel." The role of public perception in divine law. Why isn't it enough for Moshe to say in this case, "You shall be clean before Adonai"? If you're fulfilling the commandments, you've done your duty. Why is it important to be clean before Israel as well as before God, and what are implications of that? Before we jump into a lot more texts, which are going to go beyond our parsha itself, but to look at texts that quote this verse as a basis for other kinds of laws and principles, I would like to, open it up for maybe 2 or 3 comments or reactions What do you think is the significance of being blameless not only before God, but before the other people as well? If you have a thought, you can share it in the chat, or you can press the raise hand button, and we'll call on a couple of people for thoughts, and then we'll look at some texts. Vimir Reed said to prevent murmuring. To be respectful of others, help stop infighting among tribes. Robert Epstein, I saw a hand. Did you want to unmute yourself and share?
Yes. We know from other examples that public behavior has much greater gravitas than what you do in private, and the punishments have been severe historically for public behavior, misbehavior.
Great, thank you, Robert. We have another comment. Another comment from Freya. A successful society requires accountability to other people. Tanya asks, could it be free of obligations? All their vows have been filled and there's no idolatry among them. I'm not sure what the it is there, but hopefully we'll cover your question. Hashem is in covenant with Israel, says Chris, so one should be clean in front of the whole covenant. The Parsha starts out about vows. Did these tribes make a vow to enter the land and go to war? Well, I don't know if they made a vow, but God sort of swore them to give them the land. So I think it seems like ingratitude. Tamadam, I'll make sure that's clear. They're supposed to be going into Eretz Yisrael. They're supposed to cross the Jordan. Everyone's about to cross the Jordan. They're finally ready. The whole generation of rebellion has died. Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam have already died. Moshe has been told that he's going to die soon. He's given instructions for transferring power. So everyone's supposed to be about to cross the Jordan and cross into the land of Israel. And now 2.5 tribes are like, hey, how about we don't go with? How about we stay back on this side because we found some nice land here. And that's what Moshe flips out about. Thinks that they're selling out their people and that they're just being like the scouts. And then, this is the context in which they ease his concerns. Now, in the context here, I think we could read this verse minimally and to say the basic concern in the first place was that once some members of the people start to act in a way that implies cowardice or fear or disinterest in the land, that could be contagious. The same way that once a few of the scouts started saying, I don't know if we can do this, that inspired a national freakout 38 years earlier. So one could read this verse narrowly and say that accepting, being blameless before God, meaning trusting the blessing of the land, and having confidence, is very much bound up with demonstrating that confidence in a situation that is naturally fearful, like going into war. So, but we're going to see something interesting for how broadly the sages interpret this. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to look at some other rabbinic texts. So, first of all, I want to turn our attention to an entirely different area. There's a series of texts in the Mishnah and the Tosefta. The Tosefta is a less famous parallel work to the Mishnah, also published around the year 200, a little bit less polished, but this is the raw material that's the core of rabbinic literature. The Talmud is based on, and it works around the Mishnah, but quotes many of the sections of the Tosefta as well. The early chapters of the tractate on Yom Kippur in the Mishnah and Tosefta mention the different tasks of the temple and different expert priests, priestly households who were experts in different areas and were either praised or scorned for their enthusiasm about teaching and what they did. The Tosefta brings the following tradition. members of the house of Garmu, a particular priestly household family, were experts in making the showbread, the lechem hapanim, which were commanded in Exodus chapter 25, that in the tabernacle and then later in the temple, there is a set of 12 loaves of bread that sit uneaten, that sit there in front of God on the altar for a full week, 12 of them representing the 12 tribes, while the people are out working for their daily bread, so that everybody's represented in the temple at all times. And at the end of the week, the departing Kohen group would take the old bread, and a new troop would bring in new bread and replace it. And it would just stand there at all times. A sort of response to ancient Near Eastern cults that had daily bread that was consumed on the altar. It was about feeding God. This is really about representation of the people before God in an equal way. So there's this house that was expert in the preparing and the baking of that bread. And for this, they are remembered in praise. Mazkirin otam l'shevach, that fine bread, pat nikia, using that same word naki that we saw in our parsha, clean. But what that means is that bread from the finest flour, which your average civilian isn't necessarily going to be able to afford, but was used for the temple showbread. And the house of Garmu, the Kohanim of the house of Garmu, are remembered for praise because bread from fine flour was never found with their sons or daughters. They didn't use it. They never used, even if the average family, you or I, might occasionally splurge for a fancy occasion. In the house of Garmu, never ever did they bake personal bread for their household from fine flour. You never saw their sons or daughters pulling out their sandwich at school from fine flour bread. So that no one could ever say that they were fed with showbread, to fulfill that which is said, that you shall be clean before Adonai and before Israel. Now, what's interesting here is we have an expansion of our topic. Because here, the Kohanim, like everybody else, if they take their income and use it to buy their groceries in the way that they buy their groceries, and they choose to buy from the market, not from sacral goods, they were to buy fine flour and bake it to bread for a special occasion for their family to splurge a little bit, just like you or I might, they would be clean before Adonai. They haven't done anything wrong. And here they're praised for taking consideration of what other people might have wrongly thought. The other people actually would have been incorrect if they assumed that Beit Garmu were feeding their children lechem hapanim, showbread. And in fact, those other people might have been violating Torah laws. We're supposed to dan l'chaf zchut, we're supposed to judge people favorably. On what basis would somebody spread slander? You're not allowed to slander somebody without evidence. And yet they are remembered for praise for taking into consideration the thoughts, the incorrect thoughts, and the ungenerous thoughts that other people might have. In other words, it's not sufficient to say, well, I haven't done anything wrong, only God knows me, only God can judge me, I don't care what all the haters say. If you are in a position of public authority, you are praised if you take consideration to restrict yourselves in such a way as to not to give an opening for other people to have incorrect ideas. Similarly, members of the house of Avtinus, another Kohen house, were experts in the pounding of incense and raising the smoke for all the various offerings, doing it in an aromatic and beautiful way. There's an artistry in that, just as in everything else. And for this, they are remembered and praised, that no woman from among them ever went out perfumed. Moreover, when the men in that Kohen household would marry a woman from elsewhere, they would stipulate that the marriage was on condition that she would not ever be perfumed, in order that no one ever say that they were perfumed from the pounded incense, to fulfill that which is said, then you shall be clean before Adonai and before Israel. Not only, it's taken as a given that Kohanim can't get personal benefit from sacral duties. And even though it's actually a capital crime to derive personal benefit from sacral goods, from hekdesh, and therefore you'd think that people would have no reason to assume the worst. Like, why would we assume somebody's a capital criminal on no evidence? Nevertheless, these Kohanim are praised for going out of their way to live with less, to not give people the opening to think the incorrect thing about them, and to keep the reputation of public officialdom clean. You shall be clean before Adonai and Israel. I'm just going to check the chat, see if there are comments, questions. Let's see. Question, yes, this is the fences around the law, right? How rabbinic law came to add to the laws of written Torah. Yes, it's one aspect of that. It's really kind of, so far we haven't seen fences. We haven't seen legal restrictions yet. We've just seen praise. These texts didn't say that the Kohanim were required never to buy perfume or fine flour with their own money. It just says we praise them for their meticulousness and for their caution in avoiding those things. Tanya says, is that like not stealing pencils from work? Well, I think the Torah commandment not to derive personal benefit from hekdesh, from sacral property, that's like not stealing pencils from work, but that's a capital crime in the Torah. Here, the Kohanim who are experts at working with incense didn't eat. It's more like if you work in a pencil factory, they didn't buy pencils for their own personal use elsewhere. They never used pencils in their personal use. Nobody in their household would ever wear perfume, lest somebody incorrectly think that the perfume they're wearing was stolen, and they start to talk about them. When you're in leadership, you have to have a spotless reputation and be a role model. An early take on the appearance of impropriety, always avoid the appearance of evil. This gives us some responsibility over what others think of us, almost like we could cause them to sin. Okay, so now, and the very fact that they're being praised for this, rather than saying it's everybody else's responsibility to judge favorably, gives some indication that when you're in a position of power or authority, maybe there's some degree in which expectations need to be adjusted. Maybe expectations about judging favorably and not engaging in idle chatter. Maybe those restrictions are really important when it comes to peers, fellow civilians, but maybe when it comes to public officials, there's some level in which it's appropriate, it's natural at the very least, and maybe even good for people to engage in that kind of public scrutiny. When police officers say, well, you know, if you want to do all this like accountability and civilian oversight of us, if people are so distrustful of police, well, then we're just not going to do our jobs. Like maybe, actually, well, you're entrusted to carry out state-sanctioned violence. You're given a badge and a gun. You have all this leeway. It is appropriate for you to expect that people are going to be distrustful and scrutinize you. Part of signing up for this job, if you're going to be an elected official, if you're going to be a rabbi, if you're going to be a member of the cloth, maybe it's extra special reason why it's actually, you should expect and embrace that people are going to not always be trusting of you. Okay, so let's move on. I want to show how the next step of where this is taken. So far, we haven't seen any rabbinic law. We've just seen praise for those who are extra meticulous about their public perception. There might have been other Kohanim houses who made lechem apanim, showbread, or the ketoret, the incense, and weren't that meticulous. They didn't break any law, but would sometimes wear cologne or perfume outside or whatever. And maybe that's fine. They didn't break any laws, but they're not remembered specifically for praise. Now we move on into regulations, actual laws based on public perception. We're going to talk about tzedakah collectors. So this is one class of government employees who are tasked with carrying money which isn't their own. So in a non-digital economy, so if you there were all sorts of different public welfare community chests. There's like the daily fund, there's the weekly fund, there's the monthly fund, and there'd be collectors who go to door and saying, we have this many travelers who need support, we have this many people who need public assistance, have to collect. Not surprisingly, what happens if somebody comes to your door and like you don't know this person, or maybe you're just a distrustful person? How do you know that they're actually delivering all the money to where it's supposed to go? Presumably, the court is hiring people, vetting them carefully, giving background checks. But still, these are people you're entrusting, you're giving money to go to public goods. Think about when you donate to a charity and then you find out later that somebody working for the charity was misappropriating funds. So charity collectors are not permitted to separate from each other. I'll also mention that there's one version of this text that doesn't say separate from each other, lifrosh, but to make change from each other, lifrot, zamizah. I won't get into all the questions about which version of the text is more reliable and why, but I just want to let you know that both versions of that exist. For now, I'm going to go with the working assumption. I think most manuscripts have the version we have here, and that's how the Talmud records it. Charity collectors have to go around in pairs. They're not permitted to separate from each other. We'll get back to that in a second. Look at this middle section. If another person gave them coins that they owed them. So let's say I'm the charity collector. I'm coming to your house. While I'm out and about, I'm collecting from you. Your next door neighbor independently happens to owe me money for something, I not connected to my job at all. Just as a civilian, I lent somebody money because their payday was late and they had a need. I lent them money. I was a good person. The Torah requires us to lend to each other. I did an appropriate thing. I lent them money, and now they're doing an appropriate thing of paying back. Another person gives me the money that they owe me, or even if I, the tzedakah collector, finds money on the road, I'm not permitted to take it. While I'm in the act of tzedakah collecting, I'm not allowed to take any other money, even if it's totally permitted to take it. This is not an inappropriate cut. This isn't like the Trump company that's like, they were taking cutbacks, or they were like, cooking the books and not paying taxes on things that they own. This is like well beyond that. This is totally legal. Like, I am allowed to be paid back my debt. I'm as a civilian, I'm allowed to take money that I find on the road if there's no sign indicating who it could belong to. But I, as a tzedakah collector, am not permitted to take them. As it is said, you shall be clean before Adonai and before Israel. And then going back to the first part, they're not permitted to separate from each other, but they may separate from each other and collect within one courtyard or within one store. Because we want them to work in pairs. There are always eyes on them. There's always a witness as a check against dishonest action. If it's within one courtyard, they can say, okay, I'm going to take this house, you take this house. They're both in eyesight of each other. Similarly, another kind of public official who is in charge of public money, there's an annual tax called the Machatzit shekel that is equally paid by everybody, and those shkalim pay for certain public goods, including the community sacrifices. So the daily tamid offering that represents everybody is paid for from those funds. And they're like, the Mishnah and the Tosefta go into like 3 times a year when there are certain officials who go in for an appropriation period, where they go in, take the money, and actually have to go and buy on the market, buy animals from it. So there has to be oversight and regulation, how it's being done. How do you actually manage the books? So that's what Masechet Shkalim is, the bookkeeping of the temple coffers, to make sure it's well regulated, to make sure that the money is used appropriately. So when one entered to do the appropriation of the chamber, according to the Tosefta, they would search him at the entrance and the exit, and they would converse with him from the time he entered until the time he exited, to fulfill that which is said, then you shall be clean before Adonai and before Israel. And it says you shall do the upright and the good in the eyes of Adonai. And we're going to bracket that last verse for a second, but let's think about this. Why do you think, you can put in the chat, why do you think it would be necessary for the government employee who's in charge of appropriation, of allocating temple money to go make purchases, why is it important to frisk and search that person at the entrance and the exit to the temple? You can put in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Yeah, Bimia raised her hand. So
Yes, I was, no,
did
I
I
was
pronounce your name correctly?
Samaya.
Ramoya, thank you.
So, like my Hebrew name, Haya.
Great, thank you. I'll call you Chaim.
So I was gonna say that they'll check you like leaving Costco, and that's just Costco, right? I mean, this is God's money, and I can see why it would be appropriate to sort of make sure that everything's passes what they call the sniff test, right? Just making sure that everything is kosher and up to par with money, because it could cause people to stop giving. To the temple if they felt like their funds weren't going to what they were set to do.
Thank you, Chaya. Yeah, Ellen, go ahead.
It was an accident.
Oh, you didn't mean to raise your hand? Okay.
No.
Warren and Phyllis write, so as not to be falsely accused. Jen writes, to establish the amount at the beginning to verify the purchase at the end. Bruce writes, it seems clear that inherently we do not trust each other and these measures are necessary. Now, it's an interesting thing, Bruce, because there are halachot about trusting each other, being dan l'chav zchut, judging favorably. And these halachot are specifically about public officials. So going back to Chaya's comment about Costco, it may be that when it comes to civilians coming out of Costco, it's inappropriate to, the halacha wouldn't validate, checking civilians coming out of Costco. But maybe when it comes to, managers who come in who do the purchasing for Costco, that their car be checked to make sure that they are not leaving with, they had access to the storeroom, the inventory, that they're not leaving with the things. They're not using their access as a way to hoard property. Now, Costco is different because it's a private company, and we can always choose to shop elsewhere. For a government employee, it's somewhat different, or a public charity. Imagine, I think it's more similar to thinking about like somebody who works for the IRS. Now, it's a little different because we don't have, in the IRS, they're not dealing with like actual coins and gold and silver. But so it's a little hard for us to access this, but maybe think about somebody who is like a diamond dealer, or works in some other kind of precious item, physical item, and imagine if that was a publicly owned item. So people who are in this appropriation going in, you have to make sure that they didn't have gold and silver on them. What happens if they come in and then afterwards somebody sees somebody, using gold or silver, and they're assuming that that gold and silver came from when they were inside in the temple. And they're like, no, I had my wallet on me when I went to work. So they're checked at the beginning, they're checked at the end, showed that they have nothing on them. That's actually for their benefit, since they can actually be clean of unjust speculation. And it's in their interest to go through this kind of scrutiny and to say, look, I'm clean, I have nothing on me, going in, going out. That gives everybody faith in the public good. In terms of conversing with them throughout, it seems from context, based on a continuation of the passage, that one of the fears is that people could hide small pieces of gold in their mouth. But you can't necessarily, you could hide it and not be seen, but if you're talking the whole time, you wouldn't be able to get them in. And we know that that's the concern, because then in the Talmud, they're like, well, why don't they just fill their mouth with water? And when they go in, they come out there. That way we know they're not hiding gold in their mouth like Houdini did or something like that. And then the Gemara is like, well, no, but they have to say a bracha because it's a mitzvah that they're doing, so we can't do that. So just converse with them. In other words, there's oversight. So they go in, we know that they're clean, that they don't have any gold and silver on them. They talk the whole time, they can't be hiding it. Nobody has grounds for distrust. In addition onto this, the Talmud Yerushalmi adds that one earlier sage, Rabbi Ishmael, was more extreme. It said a curly-haired person can't do the appropriation because of suspicion. Somebody with really tight curly hair could hide. I mean, think of if any of you came to my class last week or any other classes during the pandemic, I had a lot of hair. I just got a massive haircut for the first time in 2 years a couple of days ago. And so if you think about hair like I had, or if you think of any other hairdo that's longer, very tightly curly hair, somebody might suspect, well, maybe you're hiding gold or silver in there. Now, according to the Tosefta, which is a little more lenient, it might just be sufficient to pat down a person. Rabbi Ishmael is a little more strict and says that somebody with that kind of hairdo just can't do this job. Got to have short hair or straight hair. And then there's another dissenting view who says no, just treasurers would untangle matted locks. So if you have to comb out your hair before you go do the job. If you want to keep your long hair, fine, but comb it out for this job, and then later on be okay. The Mishnah, kind of responding to these prior laws, comes out with just some regulations to try to standardize. It says the one who made the appropriation may not enter the chamber wearing either a bordered cloak or shoes or sandals or tefillin or an amulet, lest if he later becomes poor, people might say that he became poor because of a sin committed in the chamber. Or if he became rich, people might say that he became rich from the appropriation in the chamber. It's focused especially on that part, on the becoming rich. Later on, you come into some money because you had good business dealings, or maybe your spouse, or maybe somebody gave you money, all sorts of, or maybe you saved well, you invested. But if you went in, people are going to start to talk and say, well, he probably siphoned some money from the inside when he was in there. So the Mishnah doesn't necessarily say that it has to be searched and frisked, or that curly hair people can't do it, but does create this dress code. You got to go barefoot. You can't be wearing jewelry or amulets, anything you could hide something in, even though generally in the Tannaitic time there's an assumption that we should wear a tefillin most of the day, except for when we're working in a if we're working with manure or something like that. So normally you might wear your tefillin all day. Take your tefillin off when you're in this job. Don't wear anything extra. Wear a simple cloak, nothing with pockets, nothing with borders that you might, nothing that anybody could make a bad assumption. If you work in the public domain, we are going to legislate that you have to act in a way that shows your concern to make sure that the public doesn't have grounds to start distrusting. And I wonder if maybe there are two purposes for this. One is because often some public officials will start abusing their privilege. And by having these regulations, that removes the possibility and it exposes people who are dishonest. They'll be kept away from the work. And another reason is because part of having is recognizing that when you have power, it is reasonable to assume that people should be scrutinizing you. And that means having less trust than we might ordinarily be expected to have toward our fellows. In this case, we make legal regulations to make sure that people who are in with access to privilege are seen as blameless in the public so that the public trust in our public institutions remains high. That's what we expect about government. I want to move to one last stage of this. Public suspicions about special treatment for rich people. Now this is something that isn't going to quote our verse, but I think is thematically similar. The Talmud Bavli, Psachim, Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, page 37a. Section on requirements for matzah on Seder night. What kinds of flour are appropriate, count if you use them for making matzah, what kind of, what shapes, making matzah, etc. So the sages taught, one discharges the obligation for eating matzah on Pesach night with fine bread. You might think that, no, it has to be coarse because it's like supposed to be lechem oni, poor person's bread. The sages said, no, even if you use fine flour, that's okay. It's also okay if you use coarse bread. It's also okay to have the matzah shaped in figures. Srikin hametsuyarin. They can be like designed. You can have matzah make it in the shape of Pharaoh's chariot or something. You can do that, but they said you shouldn't. You may not bake it in shapes, figures. If you ate it, you have fulfilled your obligation, but you shouldn't do it. So Rabbi Yehuda said that Baitus ben Zonin asked the sages about that. Now, Baitus ben Zonin, you should know for context, was a famously very wealthy disciple of second century sages. He's very close to the sages. We see, in fact, in the Tosefta for Pesach, Psachim, we see that when the sages gathered all night to discuss the laws of Pesach all night long, that's at Baitus ben Zonin's ranch or mansion in Lod. He was a person he was a rich benefactor and student of the sages who, through his wealth and also his sincere love of Torah, had proximity to the sages. Think of many of the significant donors whose names are on many things in Jewish community today, who both have deep interest in Torah or Jewish communal life and also have access because of their wealth and proximity. That's Baitus ben Zonin. So he said, like, why did they say you shouldn't prepare matzah shaped in figures on Pesach, even though if you ate that, you would fulfill your obligation. There's nothing wrong with it. Why shouldn't you do it? They said, because when somebody's doing it that way, they're going to tarry over it because it's an artistic, you're going to want to perfect your artistic project, and it's going to risk becoming leavened. So if you did it and you did it appropriately and you didn't tarry, there's nothing wrong with it. We think it's bad practice. It's too risky. Some people are going to end up eating chametz. Don't do it. So he said to them, well, what if you make it with a mold? So you don't have to individually hand design it and all this within 18 minutes. Think of the frantic race for making matzah. And what if I have a mold? I can set it immediately. Boom, press it, done. So they said to him, now, people would say that all shaped matzah has been prohibited, but Baitus's shaped matzah has been permitted. In other words, people won't necessarily know that he had this special mold. Also, the special mold is probably expensive. Maybe Baitus can afford to get special fancy artistic tools that the average artisan can't afford. In his world, it's normal to think about, oh, well, okay, if it's too risky to do it that way, what if I use this fancy, expensive machinery and do it this way? That would be fine, and then I can have the super fun matzah. And then in the end, the rich guy has this, there's a general rule, you can't make fancy shaped matzah. Baitus ben Zonin has it. The sages say you're not allowed to do that because people won't assume, oh, it's just with a mold, it's okay. They'll assume you have special dispensations because you're rich. And or allowing it with a mold but not without a mold is functionally equivalent to a special dispensation for the rich. We don't allow that. And finally, that law is actually expanded beyond that. In Moed Katan, there's a general rule that like laundry and haircuts are prohibited even on the intermediate days, Chol Moed of Pesach and Sukkot, except for people returning from overseas or prison or captivity who weren't able to do preparations before the holiday. So they're given special dispensation to do laundry and haircuts. So Rabbi Zera asked, what if somebody lost an item on the eve of the festival and therefore they didn't have a chance to get a haircut or do laundry because they were searching for their lost item? Since they were a victim of circumstances beyond their control, are they permitted during Chol Hamoed to get a haircut or do laundry? Or perhaps, since the matter is not evident to everybody, no. And Abaye says, even though this isn't a rich person thing, people will say, you know, all shaped matzah has been prohibited, but Baitus' shaped matzah has been permitted. In other words, people will say, well, for whatever reason, you got special dispensations. The halakha is very concerned with the perception of equality and equity of people with privilege not getting access to do things that other people can't do. It's very important to us that Torah and mitzvot, the public good, be considered the domain of everybody, that there be public trust in order to maintain the integrity of the whole system. Okay. Yeah, there's some interesting comments about hair discrimination there. And I think the important difference is, you know, a lot of those cases where of the hair discrimination in schools and jobs and so on is based on conceptions of what, quote unquote, looks professional. It's not based on any substantive kind of consideration. It's just based on what, quote unquote, looks professional. And that's where it really smacks of racism. Here in this case, what we're saying is that we have all sorts of regulations on the person who's acting, who has access to temple money, that they not be able to hide it anywhere on their body. Now, of course, that was just a machloket. Like Rabbi Ishmael said, can't have a curly-haired person can't do it. The other opinion said, no, of course you can. You just get patted down wherever you need to get patted down. We saw the differences between Tosefta and the Mishnah. But I think it's very important not to excessively expand the implications of that case to the cases where it's just it's racist implications about how to look. Here, it's totally fine to have long curly hair. But maybe if you're doing a job in which you have access to small, valuable goods, people might not, might have some trust issues.